When honor student Charlie Williams was suspended for wearing a bright red blazer, it exposed a system steeped in racism. Her mother, a school superintendent, took on the biased rules, risking her career and reputation. What happened next would shock even the most seasoned observers. But let's start at the beginning. Early morning at Evergreen High School. The school's hallways buzzed with chatter as students discussed their plans for the day. Among them was 16-year-old Charlie Williams, known for her determination and academic success. She walked confidently toward her locker, wearing a vibrant red blazer adorned with the emblem of a recent academic conference she had attended to represent her school. It was a moment of pride for her, but it seemed to attract the wrong kind of attention. As she crossed the hall, some students looked at her with admiration, while others frowned. Around the corner stood Mrs. Deborah Crane, the school principal, whose brow furrowed at the sight of Charlie. Known for her strict adherence to rules, Crane wasted no time. "Miss Williams," she called sharply, "come to my office, now." Confused but compliant, Charlie followed the principal. Her friends exchanged worried glances, sensing trouble. In Mrs. Crane's office, as soon as they entered, Mrs. Crane didn't mince words. "You are well aware of the dress code rules. That blazer is absolutely unacceptable." Charlie tried to explain. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Crane, but this is the conference uniform. I just got back this morning and didn't have time to change." "No exceptions," Crane interrupted coldly. "Rules are rules. Dress code violations lead to disciplinary actions." "But I was representing the school," Charlie protested. "That is not an excuse. You should have known better," Crane retorted, grabbing a suspension form from her desk. Minutes later, Charlie left the office, holding a 3-day suspension notice. Her hands trembled, and her eyes brimmed with humiliation. In the hallway, her friend Derek rushed over. "Charlie, what happened?" he asked. Without a word, she handed him the paper. Scanning it quickly, Derek's face turned red with anger. "Suspended? For a blazer? This is ridiculous," he exclaimed. Derek snapped a photo of the notice and posted it on social media with the caption, "They suspended our top student for wearing her conference blazer. This is what they call justice?" The post spread like wildfire. Comments flooded in from outraged students and parents, and by lunchtime the hashtag #JusticeForCharlie was trending locally. The next day, the atmosphere at Evergreen High was electric. Students whispered in corners, condemning the suspension as unfair. The school's group chats buzzed with messages like, "Why are top students punished for small things?" and "This isn't the first time Crane's gone too far." By midday, dozens of students staged an impromptu protest in solidarity with Charlie, wearing brightly colored jackets and blazers. Some held signs reading, "Rules for all or rules for none." Meanwhile, at home, Dr. Janet Williams, Charlie's mother and a district superintendent, was poring over reports when her phone buzzed. It was Derek. "Dr. Williams," he began anxiously, "have you seen the post? Charlie's been suspended." "Suspended?" Janet's tone sharpened. "What happened?" Derek explained the situation, and Janet's expression darkened. She opened social media, scrolling through the posts. When she saw the suspension notice, her jaw tightened. "I'll handle this," she said firmly. Janet immediately called Charlie, whose shaken voice confirmed her suspicions. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, systemic issue. Back at school, the protest grew as more students joined in. Parents called the school office, demanding answers, while others shared their frustrations online. Mrs. Crane, overwhelmed by the uproar, tried to dismiss the situation as overblown. "It's just a temporary suspension," she muttered to her secretary. "They're making a mountain out of a molehill." But the numbers didn't lie. Janet reviewed school disciplinary records and discovered a disturbing trend. Black students were disproportionately punished for minor infractions. Armed with data, Janet arrived at the school that afternoon. Her composed demeanor belied the storm brewing inside her. In Mrs. Crane's office, "We need to talk," Janet said, sitting opposite the principal. "I assume this is about your daughter," Crane replied coolly. "Yes," Janet said, her tone steady. But not just her. I have questions about your disciplinary practices. Crane scoffed. All actions are taken according to the rules. Janet slid a document across the desk. Then how do you explain this? 70% of suspensions target black students, who make up only 30% of the school population. Crane's face hardened, but she remained silent. This isn't about one blazer, Janet continued. This is about systemic bias, and if you don't address it, I'll have no choice but to take this to the school board. Crane dismissed her concerns, but Janet's determination only grew. The next morning, Evergreen School became the center of widespread attention. Local news cameras captured picketers at the gates, where dozens of parents held signs reading, "Justice for all students," and "Discipline without discrimination." Reporters swarmed the entrance, trying to interview Mrs. Crane, but she refused to comment, retreating into her office. Meanwhile, Charlie and her friends organized a meeting in the school library. More than 30 students gathered to discuss how they could share their stories. Many spoke of times when they or their friends were punished for minor infractions that were overlooked for their white peers. "We need to make this public," Charlie said, standing in front of the group. "This isn't just about my suspension. It's about a system that constantly suppresses us." One of her friends suggested recording short video stories and posting them on social media. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and within hours, the internet was flooded with videos tagged #JusticeForCharlie, where students shared their experiences. That evening, tensions escalated during the school board meeting. Parents demanded explanations, while some teachers defended Mrs. Crane, claiming she was simply following the rules. When Dr. Williams entered the room, a hush fell. She stepped up to the podium. "Esteemed members of the board," she began calmly but firmly, "as a mother and superintendent, I am outraged by what is happening. We must acknowledge that our school has a systemic problem. Disciplinary actions are disproportionately applied to certain groups of students." She laid printed data on the table before the board, pointing to the figures. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the gravity of the situation. One member cautiously asked, "What do you propose, Dr. Williams?" "An immediate investigation into all disciplinary practices, mandatory inclusivity training for the administration, and the temporary suspension of the principal during the review." Mrs. Crane, seated in the audience, abruptly stood. "This is absurd. I follow the rules, and your accusations are baseless." "Whether they are or not will be determined by the investigation," Janet responded confidently. Meanwhile, social media was in an uproar. The students' videos were going viral, and local bloggers and journalists were interviewing parents. One journalist discovered that Mrs. Crane had previously worked at another school, where similar complaints about her bias had been filed. The day reached its climax when representatives from the city's Department of Education made an unexpected visit to the school. They announced the launch of an official investigation. Students watching from the windows broke into applause. By the end of the day, Mrs. Crane was called to the superintendent's office. Dr. Williams calmly stated, "You are temporarily suspended from your duties pending the investigation." Crane tried to protest, but her voice was swallowed by the tense silence. She left the office with a stony expression. When Charlie learned what had happened, she felt a mix of relief and responsibility. She knew the fight wasn't over, but the first step had been taken. Mrs. Crane's suspension sparked heated debates. Some students and parents celebrated what they saw as a step toward justice, while others claimed it was an attack on discipline and order. Meanwhile, the city's investigation revealed troubling patterns. Disciplinary records clearly showed a bias against black students and other minorities. Dr. Williams called an open meeting for the entire school community. The auditorium was filled with students, parents, teachers, and local activists. Charlie, along with a group of peers, spoke first. She explained how her suspension had been not just a personal ordeal, but a wake-up call for systemic change. Her voice trembled, but she stood strong. "We all deserve to be treated equally. This school should be a place where we are judged by our abilities, not the color of our skin." The audience erupted in applause, though tension lingered in the air. Mrs. Crane then took the stage to defend herself. "All my actions were aimed at maintaining order and discipline," I never intended to discriminate." But her words felt hollow against the evidence and testimonies presented by students and parents. After the meeting, the district board voted to permanently remove Mrs. Crane and implement significant reforms. These included mandatory anti-bias training for teachers, a review of disciplinary policies, and the creation of an independent committee to handle student grievances. A week later, the school hosted a day of solidarity. Students and parents decorated the hallways with posters promoting equality and inclusion. Charlie, alongside the student council leaders, gave a brief speech. "Today is not the end of the fight. It's the beginning. We've proven that our voices matter." The speech was met with thunderous applause. Even teachers who had been neutral or supportive of Crane began embracing the new policies. Dr. Williams received a letter from the board commending her efforts as a model for other districts. She smiled, knowing she had achieved not only a personal victory for her daughter, but also systemic change for the school. In the final scene, Charlie stood in the schoolyard, looking at her friends. "Now we know for sure, if something's wrong, we can change it." And in that moment, she realized that fighting for justice was her true path.